Hello everyone and welcome to a special kind of box opening video I want to do with you today. We've got Arthurian Legends, the new sorcery expansion. And so when I first started opening this set, I had a passing knowledge of the story of King Arthur and his knights, the sword in the stone and all that, but probably like many of you. But as I started looking into it, some of the inspiration of the cards and some knights I'd never heard of, for example, I really became amazed by the rich background that Erik Curiosa's team have drawn from. And that's why I wanted to share with you today as we explore some booster packs of Arthurian Legends and really do a deep dive on some of the Arthurian Legends lore, as well as British folklore that's inspired many of these cards. Now, stories of King Arthur go back a long time. He was supposed to have lived around the 5th century, but the first time he's mentioned in writing is not until the 10th century, written down in the Welsh annals. The most famous and comprehensive collection of stories is Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur, which was published in 1485 and covers the rise and fall of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Then we also have Spenser's Fairy Queen, which is an epic poem that deals with different facets of morality, faith and chivalry as expressed by knights and their quests. As you can see, this is only book 1 of 7 or 8, I think, and a brief disclaimer, I haven't read all the source material, so if you do find some gaps in my knowledge and things I've missed, feel free to leave a comment down below. So as we get to opening our packs, we'll get to see how these stories and the interpretations of them by the team and Sorcery's great artists come together to make, in my opinion, a pretty fantastic set. We won't be cracking quite a full box because I've been a bit cheeky and already used 3 packs to have a really fun first draft with some of my friends, but don't worry, there's still plenty to get stuck into. While opening, I'll pause on any cards that have interesting lore and give you some background on that you might have missed if you're just flicking through them by yourselves. Here we have a pack of avatars that comes with every box, and on the back of the artist's card is a picture of the Holy Grail, which is of course the object of one of the most famous of the Arthurian Knights' quests. We also see the Grail motif repeated on the booster art, and if you know a bit about sorcery, there's also a so-called Curio card of the Grail, which you can open but is exceedingly rare. So in a way, each box opening is a little quest unto itself. But now let's get started with our own quests and see what we can discover in the world of Arthurian Legends. First up, we have this enchanting creature, the Koi Nixie. Nixies are water sprites that appear in various European folklore, particularly Germanic, and also mentioned in the Nibelungenlied. So you can probably imagine they seem to act similarly to sirens, but instead are mostly found in lakes and rivers instead of the sea. They lure unsuspecting travellers to their watery grave, and sometimes they can change completely into human form, and then they can only be recognised by their wet hems of their clothing. Next up we have the Pukas. They're more shape-shifting spirits from Celtic mythology, and Puka is actually an old Irish word for spirit or goblin. They can take many forms. Here in the art we clearly see some twisted, goat-like creatures, but despite their appearance, Pukas are not necessarily evil. They're unpredictable for sure, they like to play tricks on humans, their game mechanics here reflect that. But they can also bring warnings and even good fortune, although I'm not sure about this particular Puka doing that. The first knight we encounter is a Black Knight. There are many references to Black Knights throughout Arthurian legend. Often they represent a challenge to overcome. For example, Sir Percival and Sir Gareth both have to defeat a series of knights on their quest. But they also have an air of mystery about them, and the Black Knights are an interesting storytelling device. Oftentimes the identity of Black Knights in stories will be revealed later on, to everybody's surprise. Hobs are domestic spirits and are generally described as one of the more helpful fairies. They might help with household chores, for example, in exchange for treats. The quote from William Allingham's Fairies is one of my favourite flavoured texts of this set, but I don't think this hob is one of the little men to fear in particular. The Finn folk are part of the folklore of the Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland. It's said that Finn wives start off as beautiful mermaids and look for a human husband. Failing that, she has to go back and marry a Finn man who sends her to do hard work or risk a beating. So good luck, Finn wife. Shellycoat is another creature inhabiting the rivers and streams of Scotland. She wears a coat of shells that rattles as she moves, getting the attention of many an unsuspecting traveller. The Vikings are an interesting inclusion in the set. Of course, the Viking raids and conquests are a very important part of British history, but they happen mostly from the 8th century onwards, whereas the Arthurian legends are set before that time in the late Roman and early medieval period. Still, for sorcery as a whole, they definitely fit the setting. You might be surprised to see Eastern or Arabic designs in the Arthurian legend set, but that's because Saracens feature quite often in these stories. This is quite strange because the time of King Arthur was way before the Crusades, and so there's barely any contact between these peoples. But as many of the legends were written down much later, around the 15th century, influences of the Crusades and Saracens featured in them more and more, mostly as antagonists, but there were also some more dimensions to it, as we might see later. The Haita sprites are another quite obscure type of fairy, and I'm really impressed by the depths that the sorcery team has gone to in digging into British folklore. The sprites feature in Norfolk folk tales, and depending on the account, they either protect children or they were used as threats to remind kids to be home before nightfall. Giants feature quite heavily in this set, and while this seems to be a generic one, its flavour text is from Jack and the Beanstalk, probably the most famous fairy tale about giants, written in the early 1800s. This particularly gruesome line definitely made an impression on me when I was a kid. Here's our first avatar, Archimago. He's a powerful sorcerer and antagonist from the Fairy Queen poem by Edmund Spenser. One of his main roles in the story is tricking the Red Cross Knight by making an illusion copy of his love interest. It's also been interpreted that the character of Archimago represents Spencer's criticism of the Catholic Church and the Pope as being deceitful. So this one's a bit of a blunder, because in this duel card they include a quote about two knights fighting, but it's actually misattributed. It's from the battle between Sir Lancelot and Sir Tristram in Morte d'Arthur, and not from the Fairy Queen. Probably most people wouldn't have noticed, but I've got to be a bit nitpicky here and draw your attention to it. They should just make sure this kind of thing doesn't slip through in future. The quote on "cast into exile," rightly attributed this time, refers to the banishment of Sir Uwaine from King Arthur's court. This came after Morgana tried to kill Arthur, and with Uwaine being her son, Arthur suspected them of conspiring together and so had him exiled. Leprechauns are some of the most well-known beings from Irish folklore, and you've no doubt heard about their fabled pots of gold. In pop culture, they're almost always depicted as wearing green clothes, but this leprechaun's red outfit is actually how they were usually described prior to the 20th century. The name Sherwood is something you might recognise. It's a forest in Nottingham, associated, of course, with the story of Robin Hood. In the flavoured text, we have a different reference from the poem The King's Men, and Belphoebe, who's mentioned here, is a character from the Fairy Queen. She's described as a virgin huntress, and along with her twin sister Amoret, she's one of the characters Spencer uses to represent the Queen Elizabeth. Oh, and here we have the Fairy Queen herself. In the poem, her name is Gloriana. She doesn't appear very often, but her court is similar to that of King Arthur's, and so the stories focus more on her knights who are sent on different quests. She's another of Spencer's representations of Queen Elizabeth, and is a ruler who is ideal in terms of being wise, just, and kind-hearted. I really like Séverine Pinault's representation of her here. It clearly highlights her otherworldly qualities, but still keeping her beautiful. Banshees are another well-known Irish spirit. They appear keening and wailing when the death of a family member is imminent. So I find it quite flavourful how they've translated this into game effects, that she's free to cast when a mortal dies. Redcaps or powries are malevolent little dwarf-like creatures said to inhabit castle ruins. Their caps are red because they soak them in the blood of their victims, so you really don't want to cross paths with these fairies. Here we have another knight in Sir Priamus. He's an interesting one, as you can tell by the art there are definitely some Eastern connections, and indeed he's described in Morte d'Arthur as a Saracen knight from abroad who met and fought with Gawain. They wounded each other pretty badly, and Priamus said that only he could heal wounds that were caused by his sword. In the end he healed both within an hour using a special balm, which is also depicted in the art here. Gawain was impressed by his skill, and he was brought to King Arthur, who he helps in his battles. He's eventually converted to Christianity and joined as a Knight of the Round Table. Wow, what an entrance! The Grand Wizard himself, Merlin, in all his shiny glory. Let's just look at him for a moment. It's another beautiful piece by Severine, and of course, with the full art on the back. So, everybody knows Merlin as mentor to King Arthur. His stories are difficult to summarize here without taking up the whole video, but in essence he's the driving force behind King Arthur from the very beginning, when he helps his father, Uther Pendragon, to disguise himself by magic to sleep with the married Igraine and conceive Arthur. In return, he demands Arthur be delivered to him, and he raises him to the point when he draws the sword from the stone, ultimately making him king. And throughout Arthur's reign, Merlin provides guidance and makes him the great king he is, basically. Merlin's fall comes when he becomes entranced by Vivian the Enchantress, who makes him teach her all he knows, and finally seals him and his powers away for good. So here we have the Afanc, a beast from Welsh mythology. It's one of the cards that inspired me to make this video actually, as I realised just how much lore there is behind even some of these common cards. The Afanc was a lake demon, said to have resided in the Afanc pool of the river Conwy. It was responsible for many terrible floods, so the people devised a plan to neutralise it. Because it was immune to any weapons, they decided to capture it, and surprisingly, this was done by the help of a maiden whose beauty lured the Afanc out of the lake, and the song she was singing put it to sleep. So the demon was put in chains, and with the help of mighty oxen it was carted all the way to the foot of the Mount Snowdon, where it was tossed into a remote lake where it wouldn't harm anybody. In another telling of the tale in Arthurian legend, Sir Percival managed to slay the beast, but I prefer this more convoluted version. Here we have Goswit or Goosewhite. I can't really find a reliable pronunciation guide for most of these names, but this helmet was worn by Arthur in battle and was passed down to him from his father. It might have been imbued with power by Merlin, but eventually it was buried with Arthur upon his death. The wedding hall references Arthur's wedding to Guinevere, and while in sorcery wedding the two wins you the game, in the story it's not really a happily ever after. Merlin actually advises Arthur against the marriage because he foresaw Guinevere's affair with Lancelot and the consequences of it. The wedding itself is not described in detail, but an important part is that Guinevere's father gives Arthur the round table as a wedding present, which is of course very important to the further stories. Fomorians are another race of supernatural beings from Irish myth, said to dwell under the worlds of men. They come from under the sea or the earth. That's why in sorcery you'll find them both in the water and earth elements. They are portrayed as monstrous giants and were the enemies of, and eventually also defeated by, the Tuatha De Danann, which are the more benevolent Irish deities. Sir Ironside, also known as the Red Knight of the Redlands, was an antagonist in the stories. He has the strength of 7 men and was feared for killing other knights. He did this because the brother of a lady he loved was slain by one of Arthur's knights and he promised her vengeance. The flavor text refers to his encounter with Borman, who fought with him for an entire day and finally bested him. Sir Ironside surrendered and promised to make good what he'd done, and in the end he was even made Knight of the Round Table for his prowess and strength. Blue caps and knockers are actually 2 different kinds of spirits that have here been merged into one. Unlike their murderous cousins the red caps, blue caps were seen as good omens in the mines. Their glowing blue lights indicated rich veins of ore, and in return they did expect a share of the profits for their help. The knockers are spirits that inhabit Cornish mines. They get their name from the knocking sound they used, either to guide miners to the tin ore or to warn them from imminent collapse. One interpretation was also that they were spirits of people who had died in the mines, and miners would throw the remaining part of their Cornish pasties into the mines for tribute. The Mester Store worm was a massive sea serpent from Orkney folklore. It could devour entire kingdoms, and one king, threatened by its rival, was advised to sacrifice 7 virgins each week to appease the worm. Eventually his kingdom was running out of young women, and in desperation the king offered his daughter's hand in marriage to whoever could slay the beast. One guy named Asipatl fills a boat full of hot peat and rows out to meet the worm, who promptly swallows him. It coughs him up again as the peat starts burning it up from the inside, and as the worm dies, its teeth fall out to form the Orkney Islands, while its body curls up and forms Iceland. The Iron Man Talus is Sir Article's squire in Book 5 of the Fairy Queen. He's an early representation of an actual robot. In the story, Talus acts as Article's brutal henchman. He shows no pity or remorse and is immune to things like a woman's beauty, which entrances Article in one of the stories. Talus enacts unquestioning justice and at some points even needs to be stopped by Article, who is more likely to show mercy. Gaheris is part of a family of knights with 3 brothers who are all part of the Round Table: Gawain, Agravain and Gareth. That's a lot of G's. Their mother is Margos and father is Lot, king of Orkney and Lothian. Among his brothers, Gaheris is probably the least well known or mentioned in stories. As a teen, Gaheris defects from his father to join Arthur. Along with his brothers, he's knighted for his feats in battle against rebels and the Saxons. There's also a tragic side to Gaheris, where it's prophesied by the fairies that he'll cause the death of his own mother, which he eventually does by beheading her in a fit of rage when he catches his mother sleeping with the son of King Pellinore, his father's killer. He's exiled for his crimes, but later rejoins the Round Table for one of the final acts, the execution of Queen Guinevere. He's one of the knights asked to guard the execution and is finally slain by Lancelot, who's trying to rescue her. How they end up in that particular mess is a story for another time. So the Ninth Legion, also called Legio Nona Hispana, was a Roman legion who disappeared from all records after about 120 AD. One theory is that the legion was wiped out in battle against the northern tribes of Britain or Scotland. It seems fitting then that they'd return as undead to haunt Arthur's lands. Here we have another interesting knight, Sir Morian. You might notice that his colour palette is quite similar to Priamus, and indeed he's also a foreign knight in the Arthurian tales. He's described as a Moor, which was a medieval term for inhabitants of Muslim lands. That's also where his name is derived from. He has a black complexion and actually has a mixed heritage, his father being Sir Aglavale and his mother a Moorish princess. His father abandons him, and much of his quest is proving himself and seeking his father. He actually knights himself and battles many other knights along his way. Another interesting fact is his card ability, as he's said to simply cut in half spears that were hurled at him. His story actually has a happy ending when, meeting Lancelot and Gawain on his quest, they reunite him with his lost father, and Sir Aglavale travels back to marry Morian's mother, and they're able to recover their honour and her lands. The Seelie and Unseelie courts are the divisions of fairies into good and bad, and it's a classification found in Scottish folklore. The Unseelies were associated with witches, and were not just tricksters, but also actively had evil intents. So that brings us to the end of our box opening. I hope I helped you discover some new things about the lore behind this really flavorful expansion of sorcery. Be sure to add anything I missed in the comments, and also let me know whether you enjoy this kind of content. Of course, there's many cards I didn't cover because I didn't encounter them in this box, but maybe they're waiting in another one. So until next time, sorcerers.